The 6th of May, 1945. A general from Germany entered Dwight Eisenhower's office in Reims, France, with a remarkable suggestion. It was General Alfred Jodel's arrival that nightfall, with Admiral Hansorg in tow. Von Friedberg, who had recently failed to negotiate a different kind of peace with Montgomery 2 days prior. They carried a fresh proposal. Germany would submit to America and Britain right away. Each and every soldier, each tank, and each aircraft on the Western Front would surrender its weapons. However, there was a requirement. Germany desired to continue battling the Soviet Union. Not only do they continue to battle, they desired American supplies and fuel, American assistance. The High German, an alliance was being suggested by command. The adversaries of yesterday battling together, opposing the Red Army. Alfred, General, in front of Eisenhower's staff. Jodl stood and presented the argument. The Soviet Union was the genuine danger to Western civilization. Germany has been impeding their progress for 4 years. If America allowed them to go on, Stalin might be stopped right now. Lines. Eisenhower's reaction would influence the history of the following 50 years. Adolf Hitler had shot 6 days prior, at his bunker in Berlin. His Admiral Karl was the chosen successor. Donitz, the German Navy commander. Donat considered himself to be a naval officer. Regardless of his opinions on Nazi ideology, he had observed Germany's collapse of the strategic position over 4 years. A nightmare was inherited by him. Berlin had been captured by the Soviets. American as well as at the Elbe, Soviet soldiers had connected river, dividing Germany in two. Millions. Several German soldiers were imprisoned in places in Europe that have nowhere to go. Donitz had a firm understanding of one thing. We lost the war. Germany was unable to prevail. However, he also had another understanding. Germany could yet decide who it lost. 2. Giving yourself over to the Americans meant trials for some prisoners of war, leaders, profession, and ultimately, reconstructing. Give yourself over to the Soviets entailed expulsion and systematic violence. To the work camps in Siberia and the German servitude for all time. Individuals. Donitz made a thoughtful choice. He would only attempt to give up to the West while carrying on the battle in the East. Each and every German soldier on the Eastern Donitz understood what the front did. Captivity in the Soviet Union meant death. The Red. The army had lost 27 million soldiers, battling Germany. Soviet soldiers had freed detention camps and observed personal knowledge of German atrocities. Not only was revenge acceptable, but it was encouraged. German soldiers who gave themselves up to the vigorous. Soviets were subject to summary execution, decades of famine in outdoor camps, of Siberian forced labor. Out of about 3 million German soldiers, historians claim that the Red Army captured. An estimated 1 million people perished in confinement, a death rate that is higher than Sancher. When in British or American hands, the death rate was less than 3%. It was easy math. Give up the West or die East. German soldiers fled as a result. Whole sections gave up on their positions and moved west in the hopes of arrive to U.S. lines ahead of the Soviets, captured them. German citizens carried out the bras. Same. Millions of refugees blocked the routes, escaping the Red Army's advance. women who were aware of what transpired in Prussia East, family that were able to hear. Soviet artillery is getting closer to every hour that goes by. For a mom in a soldier in a foxhole or a refugee cart, each hour of bargaining in Rons wasn't diplomatic. It made the difference between a life in either a death in the East or the West. Donut's suggestion to Eisenhower wasn't abstract approach. It was the desperation, computation of a country observing the clock ran out. On May 4th, Donuts made its first effort. Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg was dispatched by him to Bernard, the British Field Marshal, Montgomery's Lüneburg headquarters. Health. Von Friedberg suggested precisely what Donuts desired. German troops in the Twelve. The British would take control of the North. Yet he also desired to incorporate German forces confronting the Soviets. Particularly, fighting in the East is Army Group Vistula. A portion of the offer was accepted by Montgomery. He accepted the surrender of around 1,000,000 German soldiers in Holland, Denmark, and northwest Germany. However, he declined to make contact with the Eastern Front. No, distinct agreements that did not include the Soviets. The tactical capitulation was signed. The bigger plan had failed. After learning the news, Donuts didn't provide. Montgomery would have to cope with the Eastern query. Possibly Eisenhower would. He dispatched an officer with a higher rank to give it another go. Alfred Jodl, General, head of operations for the German High Command, took a plane to Rons on May 6th beside him was von Friedberg. Jodl transported the same suggestion, and he carried something different. Permission to bargain. Alfred Jodl was among the most experienced officers in the German armed forces. He had served as Hitler's principal strategic advisor all through the conflict. He was now seated across from the Chief of Staff of Eisenhower, Walter Bedell Smith, General, making Germany's situation. The dispute was simple. Germany was unable to endure the Soviet takeover. Stalin's communist forces were already in place. Dictatorships in Romania, Poland, and Hungary. They would follow suit, all the places they occupied. Germany had been engaged in combat with the Soviet Union for a period of 4 years. German soldiers were aware of Soviet strategies, Soviet flaws, Soviet supply weaknesses. If assistance was given by the Western Allies, Germany might keep holding the Inraskeitend eastern boundary. Jodl suggested that German forces submit to the United States and Great Britain while keeping a defensive stance, opposing the Red Army. American manufacturers would keep them at odds. American aviation, they would be supported by power. It was obvious what was implied. This wasn't simply give up. This was a suggestion to change sides. Jodl and Eisenhower never met individually. He declined to be in the same German officers in a room until they agreed to give up without conditions. The rejection wasn't merely businesslike. Eisenhower had gone for a walk 3 weeks prior, via the concentration camp at Ohrdruf. He had witnessed the piled corpses, the strolling skeletons and cremation pits. He had given the order for every American unit in the region to observe what the Nazi government had completed. Generals from the regime were requesting an alliance from him. The first moral disgust was instinctive. However, Eisenhower also recognized the strategic argument, and he recognized why it was not feasible. The U.S. was still engaged in combat. Japan. Military strategists in the United States were anticipating the Soviet Union's involvement into the Pacific War to aid in the Japanese downfall. Betraying Europe and Stalin would entail battling Japan by yourself. The American public continued to witness the Soviets as valiant allies. Newspapers depicted Uncle Joe Stalin as amiable companion. The notion of abruptly joining forces alongside Nazi Germany in opposition to the Russians would have led to political mayhem. At Yalta, Roosevelt had reached accords. Eastern Europe would be under Soviet occupation. Germany would be split up into occupying zones. Violating those commitments meant America's promises broken. Additionally, there was the most realistic issue of all. The 11 million men in the Soviet Union were under arms, with around 6.5 million troops on the front lines in Europe alone. Should Eisenhower agreed to the German suggestion, while Stalin continued to battle, the Red Army may not end in Berlin. They could march over the Atlantic. Eisenhower had to make an unfeasible decision: accept the German offer and take a chance, reject the Second World War with the Soviets, and give Stalin half of Europe he had. I've only observed one authoritarian government, caused millions of people to suffer. He was now being asked to select between facing someone else or leaving them. Millions more are under its control. Eisenhower's reaction to Yodel was supplied through General Smith. It was not a bargain. It was a demand. Germany would give up without conditions to every allied nation, including the Soviet Union. Every German army on every front would stop fighting. Concurrently, there wouldn't be a distinct peace with the West. If Germany declined, Eisenhower would bring the Western lines to an end. The United States and British troops would no longer accept Germans give up. Each and every German soldier, anyone attempting to escape west, would be turned back, straight into the hands of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower, Yodel was given a deadline, but it wasn't midnight on May 8th, or suffer the repercussions. Donuts received an urgent communication from Yodel. Eisenhower was not playing a ruse. The Americans would actually compel soldiers to give themselves over to the Soviets if Germany refused to accept unconditional terms. Donuts had to face the end of his approach. The Allies in the West would not protect Germany from the Soviet Union. Would not form a coalition to oppose Stalin. Not every member of the U.S. command believed Eisenhower was making the appropriate option. George Patton, the general, was alerting people to the Soviet menace for months. He had witnessed Red Army conduct in the regions where Soviet and American forces came together. He had studied intelligence, reports of numerous crimes and deportations in Soviet-occupied territory. Patton was enraged. Anyone who would listen was informed by him that the wrong enemy had been vanquished by the Americans. Germany was in ruins. The USSR was the actual threat. He said the same thing. The German strategic reasoning. Speaking. Turn the Wehrmacht around. Make use of German soldiers with the skills to combat the Soviets. Return Stalin to the pre-war era, bounds during the time that U.S. forces were still at maximum power. According to Patton, America would have to battle the Soviet Union. Eventually, it would be better to use battle right now, air supremacy and hardened troops. Later, when the Soviets had recovered and produced nuclear weapons, he was advised to keep silent by his superiors. Openly supporting a conflict with America's career suicide was an ally. However, Patton was unable to remain silent. The the window was closing, and no one was inside. Washington appeared to be concerned. He wasn't the. This is only one person's perspective. Winston. Churchill had given his military personnel orders to create strategies for assaulting the people. Soviets. The strategy was known as Operation Unimaginable. Churchill's strategists suggested rearming 100,000 German soldiers, around 10 divisions, to combat with Allied forces in an unexpected assault on the Red Army. July 1st was the goal date. The German plan was not Nazi desperation. It was the same tactical reasoning that military leaders in the West were thinking about it in secret. Jodl sent Donitz a note regarding Eisenhower's demand. He produced one final computation. He gave Jodl permission to sign the unwavering submission, but he also issued covert directives. German troops in the West would promptly cease hostilities. However, German soldiers are up against the Soviets, would persist in their opposition as long as feasible. Each hour purchased time for more civilians and soldiers to escape. West. The Eastern Front held every hour, resulted in the saving of countless more lives. It was a race against time. The instant Eisenhower recognized what was occurring, he would shut down the Western lines. Donuts have to purchase as many hours as you can. The German Navy would quicken cross-Baltic Sea evacuations. Already, Operation Hannibal was the largest ever naval evacuation, saving 1 to 2 million Soviet soldiers and civilians occupied land. It would go on to the very end. Donuts was engaging in a double game. He would provide Eisenhower the document of surrender he commanded, but he would disregard its need for a concurrent ceasefire on every front. 2:41 a.m. The 7th of May, 1945. General Jodl signed the document that, at Eisenhower's headquarters, capitulation in Ron. The European war was formally over. However, it wasn't. The time was still in motion. German forces maintained, battling for 2 more days in the east. Stalin became enraged upon discovering Ron gives up. He witnessed precisely what the Germans had done. Turned over to the West while still battling the Soviets. He insisted on a second surrender ceremony. This one would occur in Berlin at the Soviet headquarters with Soviet leaders in charge. Wilhelm Kittel, the field marshal, on May 8, signed the surrender once more at Karlshurst. Georgy Zhukov, a Soviet marshal, ensured the world witnessed German officers surrendering to the power of the Soviet Union. The signing occurred in Moscow late on May 8. It was past midnight already. The West commemorates victory on May 8 inches Europe. Victory Day was observed by the Soviet Union, May 9th. Even the surrender date became disputed. Even so, Hermann, resistance persisted. A few units engaged in combat until May 11th, purchasing time for the final. Brief evacuations. Donutz's plan had partially succeeded. Thousands upon thousands of German soldiers arrived at British and American lines. Prior to the ultimate ceasefire, millions of citizens fled the Soviet profession. However, the bigger risk had not paid off. There would not form a Western coalition against Stalin. Eastern Europe would lag behind, what Churchill would later refer to as the Iron curtain. And for those who didn't escape, the horror was only starting. The Germans' warnings came to pass, indeed, and it occurred quickly. Inside, months after the capitulation, the Soviets had put in place communist puppet regimes throughout Eastern Europe. Poland's democratic leaders were detained or carried out. Czechoslovakia's a strange fall claimed the minister's life, a window. Free elections were pledged at Yalta never took place. Opposition. Parties were prohibited. Covert police gathered anyone who was suspected of anti-communist sentiment. The iron. The curtain fell just where German and Soviet troops had come together in May 1945. 100 million individuals discovered themselves confined behind it. The soldiers from Germany, who had given themselves over to the Soviets, just as severely as donuts had anticipated. Approximately 1 in 3 people passed away in imprisonment. The final German PSWs, roughly 10,000 men referred to as the late returnees, were not published until October of 1955, after Chancellor Conrad of West Germany. Moscow visit by Eisenhower. 10 years following the conclusion of the conflict, these guys got off trains and into a nation they no longer acknowledged. Their relatives had grieved for them and moved on. Their kids had grown up. Without them, they were war ghosts that Germany had tried for 10 years to forget. However, it was already too late to take any action regarding it. President Truman declared the Truman Doctrine. The U.S. would be against Soviet expansion across the globe. The containment strategy had started within. NATO was established in 1949. The United States, France, Britain, and other Western countries established a military coalition in opposition to the Soviet threat. Eisenhower had rejected the partnership, existed 4 years prior, only without Germany. In 1955, a changed, denazified democratic West Germany, reconstructed under Allied oversight, was rearmed and accepted into NATO. The date of admittance was the 9th of May 1955, precisely 10 years to the day following the Berlin was the site of a Soviet-led surrender ceremony. The Bundeswehr was formally founded. November of that year. It wasn't the Wehrmacht, revived. It was a brand new army under integrated democratic citizen control into the command structures of the West. However, a large number of its officers had served in 1945. They recalled the suggestion that had been turned down. The distinction between 10 years and 100 years separated 1,945 and 1,955. Millions of prisoners imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain. The reasoning behind the strategy had been sound. It had not been able to time it. In 1953, Eisenhower was elected president. He oversaw the Cold War for 8 years, war that may have been avoided, and he never apologized in public for rejecting the German suggestion. He insisted that complete surrender to all allies was the only appropriate result. However, by 1945, the Soviets were worn out. The might of American Air Force was overwhelming. American business remained unaffected. Then a conflict could have been winnable in ways that subsequently it wasn't a confrontation. Each of them, Churchill, Patton, and the Germans, were shown to be correct regarding Soviet aims. Whether they were correct regarding the great unanswered question is still the solution. 20th century question. However, 4. The 100 million individuals who are stuck behind the Iron Curtain. The response didn't matter. The Berlin Wall was built. Families spent decades apart. People who were attempting to cross were shot from east to west. Eisenhower had not declined to a coalition. Wait, he had said. Moreover, there was a 45-year wait.